perhaps I could get started by welcoming you all to our Wednesday Global Talk. And I'll start with our land acknowledgement to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the center stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So before introducing our speaker, Debra, thanks so much for joining us, Debra. We'll go through a few housekeeping items. We'll note that we ask you to keep your microphones and your videos turned off while Debra's speaking. There's, of course, the chat function in which you can share comments or perhaps links. It's been a very effective way for other conversations to continue during Debra's talk and inspire more kind of collaboration. But there will be a Q&A, and for that you can either turn on your microphone and turn on your video when it's your turn to ask a question, or you can also use the question function in the Zoom webinar as well. So, and otherwise to note, as you are already familiar, of course, that the presentation is being recorded. Just a quick note on COVID protocols. This is our last global talk in January. So we have noted that as far as responding to the universities and the public health officers' recommendations, that we would, for the month of January, conduct all of our global talks on Zoom, do it virtually. However, next week, we will return in a gradual way to our seminar room. So there will be a room for a small number of us to be in the seminar room. I'll present from the seminar room. And then what we'll also do as we start to adjust our own protocols here at the center to something approaching more normal, we'll also, as a sort of transition stage, invite people to join us in C168 following the global talk. That is to say, the global talk will be a Zoom webinar in addition to the conversation in the seminar room from 10:30 to 12, but then from 12 to 12:30, if people wanted to join us with a coffee and a muffin or bring their lunch, that would be welcome too. And so, actually, you know what? I'll backtrack on the lunch bit, but we will have cookies and muffins. Okay. So Debra, thank you so much for joining us. A real pleasure to be able to welcome you to give today's talk. Debra is a doctoral student in psychology at UVic. Her research focuses on the experiences of forced migrant youth living in transit in Malaysia or along the Thai-Myanmar border, and examining how these youth negotiate their sense of identity, belonging, and future aspirations in such precarious contexts. She's drawing at this point on her ongoing partnership project, exploring the ethics, benefits, and challenges of engaging in virtual transnational partnership research. How timely, how topical, I mean, the virtual research. Opportunities and challenges with forced migrant communities. The title of her talk today is "What Can Ethical Research Praxis Look Like Between Global North and South Partners?" This is a case study, but it's of course a subject in which many of us are very closely involved in and interested in. So Debra, I turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Martin, for that warm introduction and welcome. And thank you all for joining me today. I will pull up my screen before I forget. And let's see, of course, if you can't see it, someone can unmic and let me know. So yes, as Martin mentioned, my name is Debra. I'm grateful to be speaking to you right now from Lekwungen territories as well, where I have lived for the past 4 years. And for today, I'll be presenting on my kind of work in progress PhD research. I am still in the earlier phases. And I'll be presenting a case study on ethical research between global North and South partners. And it's more of like a reflexive case study where I'm reflecting on my thinking and experience rather than kind of the nuts and bolts of the project itself. Before I get too far ahead of myself, I just want to thank the Center for Global Studies and big shout outs to Martin and Jody for hosting me as a fellow, graduate student fellow this year. It's been a really unique and special opportunity to interface with folks outside of my discipline and a really enriching learning experience. And okay, I will launch it. So as my project, like for my PhD, is situated within a larger project called the Youth Migration Project that is run by my supervisor, Dr. Jessica Ball. So what I'll do is I'll give a bit of an overview to that project and then explain the method that we're using within that project called the peer-mediated storyboard narrative method. And then I'll talk about the partnership project within that, and that's with Suwannimit Foundation along the Thai-Myanmar border, and our methodology, which we use a participatory methodology with an anti-oppressive epistemology. I'll talk about how we kind of put that theory into practice, what I've learned from that experience, and then I'm taking questions and feedback. Again, as I mentioned, like especially at this stage, I know there are many people here with expertise in this area, and I would kind of love to hear comments. This is very much, you know, a work in progress. So the Youth Migration Project is a SSHRC-funded, multi-sited research project. And its original intent was to explore using this innovative arts-based method that was designed by Jessica, my supervisor, as a youth-centered approach to hearing about youth's experiences of forced migration, and particularly while still living in contexts of prolonged displacement or being in transit. And so I'm going to describe the method because it is relevant to the partnership project as well. So in this method, youth were given a kit of art supplies and a foam core poster board to take home, and given questions to ponder about how they were impacted by forced migration. At the earlier phases of the project, the questions were a little bit more prescripted around, you know, how migration affected their sense of identity, home, belonging, and future aspirations. And this has shifted over time, but in general, it has always been like fairly open-ended. And the idea was that youth would reflect on these questions, kind of start their storyboard, and meet back in small peer groups, ideally 3 or 4 peers, over a period of 4 to 5 sessions. And this would give a chance for people to share their stories, and then for other youth in that little circle to ask questions, for the facilitator, or who is usually a member of the research team, to also ask questions or clarifications. And when we were doing this as a method of like data collection, which to an extent we still are, youth's narratives are audio typed and then transcribed for data analysis. And so I mentioned that it was multi-sited and a couple different phases of research. So in fall 2019, we did collect data from youth who were living in transit in Malaysia, and that was 40 youth from North African and Middle Eastern countries and 12 Rohingya youth from Myanmar. And then beginning in March 2020, we began kind of the second phase of data collection in Thailand. But in addition to hearing from youth about their stories, we also wanted to see whether the peer-mediated storyboard narrative method could actually be used as like an intervention, like a psychosocial intervention, providing some network of peer support and empathy and some relief from a lot of the difficulties that these youth were facing. And so we've been trying it out with our partner, which will be the focus of the presentation. And one of our team members as well has been trying out the method, Angela, in different settings within Thailand. Oh, yeah, so I've highlighted that. So before I talk about the project in more depth, I really want to highlight the members of my team here because they are so integral to my learning and my experience in this project. So I'll start at the bottom left corner. I've mentioned my supervisor who helped to create this partnership project, and that's Jessica Ball. And as we scoot over to the right, in the bottom right corner, we have Pipat, who is the executive director of Suwannimit Foundation, and that is our partner foundation. Above her is Spring, who is a project officer at Suwannimit Foundation, and Neta to the left of that is a project coordinator there. Both Spring and Neta have been very instrumental in actually working directly with youth. So in what I'm doing and with Jessica's, we're working more with the folks that you see here on the screen, but we're not working directly with youth to implement it. So they've been very helpful in terms of carrying that out. And then to the top left, we have Angela, who works for an education foundation in Thailand called Beam, and it's a nonprofit that supports forced migrants. And she teaches and has a counseling degree and has really been involved in this youth migration project since, I believe it's inception. She and Jessica have worked together for a long time. So some context for why we are looking at this Thai-Myanmar border, like why it's relevant to be doing this work there. So there's been armed conflict by the Myanmar military against ethnic minorities since 1962. And many people have fled to Thailand, and there have been influxes of migration following the military coup that occurred in 1988. And then really recently in February of 2021, and that's still like ongoing. There are currently people who are like thousands of people who are fleeing Myanmar even today because of the military violence. And these statistics are a bit outdated because they predate the 2021 coup, I believe. So prior to I guess the 2021 coup, there was 100,000 refugees who were registered with the UNHCR. And they were living in the 9 refugee camps along the Thai-Myanmar border. But there are many people who flee and are not living in the refugee camps. So an estimated 2 to 3 million live outside of these camps. And it's also estimated that 30% of forced migrants from Myanmar are youth. And we're hearing from people there that there is a mental health crisis at the border. I've heard from youth directly there that there's lots of hopelessness, suicidality, feelings of depression. And some of the challenges are that the smaller NGOs, non-governmental organizations, often don't have the training or resources to meet the high degree of psychosocial needs that kind of permeate this area. And so that brings me to the formation of the partnership. So Suwannimit Foundation, it's a migrant-led foundation that delivers essential services to marginalized communities along the Thailand-Myanmar border. So for example, they provide like health services, vocational training, youth empowerment, and education. And they are based in Mesot, which is in Tak province. So I put a little map just to highlight that it is right next to Myanmar. And so that border is really porous, and there are people who traverse across that border, I think, daily. And it's Mesot is about 4 kilometers. So it's a pretty big hub for industry and cross-border trade. And so in the fall of 2019, that was when the data collection in Malaysia was ongoing, and Jessica and Angela, who was a Thailand-based team member, went to Mesot and they introduced the method there. And that's where they received feedback that that this method actually might be a useful way to provide psychosocial intervention that didn't require a lot of specialist training. And so that was really the first goal of our partnership then. You know, we kind of created these connections with Suwannimit Foundation and thought maybe this is where we could try this out. And the secondary goal was to continue to hear from youth about their experiences of forced migration. As the Thailand-Myanmar border, it differs from the Malaysia context. And so we applied for funding, and then in March 2020, we received funding. And everybody knows in March 2020, any plan that you had did not unfold as expected. So initially we were supposed to, myself and Jessica were supposed to travel to Thailand in the summer. And as the COVID crisis unfolded, and it was just so clear at that time that international travel wasn't going to happen. So we were kind of faced with a choice of whether to transition the project online or to keep delaying it indefinitely. And we decided to try it out online. And I think ultimately it led to this kind of surprising but really positive new journey together with our partners. And so we began meeting virtually in mid-March 2020 with Suwannimit Foundation stakeholders, and with Angela and a few other people who kind of have trickled in and out of our meetings, depending on availability. And it's hard to estimate exactly how often we meet because it does seem to vary depending on the crisis context there. But at the start, it was probably every 2 weeks or once a month. And it's a process of, I'll call it train the trainers, in the sense that we are working directly with the team members that I showed you, like showing what the peer mediated storyboard method is, and then talking about it and kind of negotiating key concepts and deliberating over like how it could be delivered and what would be useful, and integrating their feedback. So that's the process that I'm going to focus on in my next few slides. I'll start with our methodology first. So we initially conceived the project to be collaborative. And we thought of doing something within the community-based research realm, but I think transitioning online actually facilitated more authentic engagement with this, because originally we would have flown to Thailand and done more of a style of the Canada-based team being in the role of teaching about the method rather than it being this kind of ongoing back and forth. And so the pandemic and like having a bit more time made it possible to do slow science and to be able to really make this a collaborative and iterative process. And over time, I think it became much more authentic, like close to this community-based participatory research model that many of you are aware of. So I'll briefly define it, though, for those of you who may not be as familiar. So it aims to respond to a social issue that a community has identified as important by co-producing knowledge about the issue and creating change. And the community is engaged in all phases of research, and it really is intended to validate and kind of elevate their expertise and knowledge. And although it is a widely celebrated and used and great method, it has been subject to some criticisms. So people have talked about the gaps between theory and practice, as well as on its greater attention to uplifting community voices rather than on shifting balance of power, or more like focusing on collaboration rather than giving power back to community. And so I felt that, I really wanted to focus more on these kind of power dynamics given the history of global kind of North and South partnerships. And so we situated our participatory methodology within this anti-oppressive research framework. And there are a lot of overlaps here. They both kind of commit to social change and taking an active role in that change. Anti-oppressive research, it's also developed from anti-racist, anti-colonial, and critical theories, as well as anti-oppressive practice in social work. Many of these theories have been developed and enacted in activist communities and Indigenous and racialized communities. And so doing my best to do this theory justice, and I'm very much kind of standing on the shoulders of giants here. Anti-oppressive research, it really requires critical self-reflection on the researcher self-location and explicitly identifying and being open about areas of power and privilege. And then the research itself is kind of grounded in these political and kind of social justice aims. And it also, it's really also relational in that the relationships between stakeholders is professional as well as personal. And I think this actually plays a role in how power dynamics are shifted too. So it really focuses on what are the current power dynamics and how can we shift them. Okay, so I will now get into like how we actually took up these theories together. And I'll highlight these 4 areas of reflexivity and humility, prioritizing genuine relationships, fostering reciprocal relations of knowledge production, and community ownership and transformation. So starting with reflexivity and humility, I think reflexivity is really about these uncomfortable questions. So I'm going to focus here on like really myself and my positionality in this research. So I had to ask, what are my areas of power and privilege? And knowing that I have many, what do these signal about my responsibilities in this research? I'll get into my self-location in more detail in a bit, but because of the power and privilege that I hold, how might I risk complicity and acting as an oppressor in this research? So how can I, even inadvertently or reinforce the erasure of the voices of forced migrant communities that have been marginalized for so long. And part of that is, looking at how I prioritize my own knowledge or expertise in a subject matter in relation to my partners. And so I think, asking these questions in and of themselves really promote humility. And I thought a lot about, or engaged in thinking about my positionality and humility by attending to what's called critical historicity, which is kind of thinking about, what are the historically rooted dynamics between global North and South partners, and how might that impact our current partnership? And knowing that, like, if I want to create a more equitable or ethical relationship, I have to understand, like, the way things are done to know how to change things. Like, where could I go wrong in order to make things more just? And in so doing, that allows me to reposition myself as a co-learner in this project, being mindful that I definitely don't have a lot of answers here, and so I have limitations to what I know, and it's very much a learning process for me. And so just a little bit deeper into how I used anti-oppressive research, like how that lens helped me to reflect on my positionality. So I thought about, what are the areas of privilege that are, at least in this project, most salient. So being kind of white, Western, educated, in a global North institution, living in a stable country with citizenship. There were many times where I thought about my safety living in Canada, especially as COVID was unfolding. We had access to vaccines much earlier than our partners did. And even when they did, there were several COVID outbreaks that were quite damaging there. And so it involved confronting my own feelings of guilt too in this process of having that physical safety here, conflicted feelings about benefiting from this project as I get to apply it towards my PhD, and thinking about, okay, well, how can I ensure that, or help to ensure that our partners are also benefiting in some way? And so using this lens really helped me to think about, what my assumptions were. Some of these assumptions were tied to how what I knew of approaching research. And some of my earlier, even undergrad training was more situated in like this positivist or objectivist kind of lens, and less so of thinking about, who I am and what I bring to the research. So that was a lot of the learning that I did through this process, and thinking about how to do research differently in a crisis context as compared to the non-crisis contexts that I've worked in. And in doing this kind of work, it also meant bringing my full kind of self. So it meant kind of being human, being personal, and not kind of holding back my own emotional experiences and thoughts. And so the next piece that I'll talk about is this genuine relationship building. And I know this is something that is talked about quite often, and so that many of you probably have some experience with. So I want to highlight maybe just how we did this, because although it's talked about often, sometimes we don't break it down into what are we actually doing to forge these relationships. I think one of the biggest pieces, especially working remotely, right? I'm not there. I don't see what their day-to-day realities are. So I have to be very intentional about asking, what is going on in our community's partners' lives? What does their day-to-day reality look like? What am I not seeing when we meet over Zoom? And whatever they want to share, of course, like they do, and whatever they don't want to. But that meant that helped to create these more personal relationships, and meeting over time too. Like, of course, building trust and rapport is so key to good partnership work. And so I think here, having the pandemic slow us down, us being able to meet more frequently over a longer period of time, helped to build that trust and rapport. I did name the power differences, and it was interesting. Our partners didn't respond much when we referenced this, but I think that is important to at least, acknowledging where I'm situated, what I don't know. And so, because even if they're not necessarily responding, it could impact their safety with voicing disagreements. We did bring this method, so I wanted to kind of create as much accountability as we could. And then to seek feedback about how the process is going. We had check-ins, we had discussions about what was going on for each of us in the project and what they thought about the method. Something that came out of this was just how important it was, like when we could understand what was their, like how they were dealing with crises that were unfolding and always putting out fires. It allowed us to be more flexible too. So we've had periods of time where we don't meet for a few months. And one of our partners had said that flexibility has been really good for relationship building. Another point that I heard this in a talk, and I liked just the way that it was framed. They talk about emotion and empathy as a part of the method. And so this is the piece around just like listening deeply to partners' perspectives. And when we listen deeply, we listen to what's going on for them. That allows us to adapt or abandon parts of the project that don't fit, even if we had intended it for it to be that way. I've also heard this talked about within the framework of relational ethics. So this is, again, like entering the participants' contexts and forming kind of mutual bonds of trust and empathy. And I just have some quotes throughout about what our community partners have said. And again, this is one around, we have to adjust to doing this work online. The key is flexibility and that we can understand each other and move on with the obstacles. Not too much expectations. We have to go with the flow. So then with fostering reciprocal relations of knowledge production, this is really about creating spaces to learn from one another. So I think this is where I was reflecting on how are we jointly learning, engaging in this process of personal learning or discovery, and what are some of the constraints that we faced in doing this? So one of the ways that we helped to kind of create this space was through practicing the method together. We actually, each of us created our own storyboards and we practiced being facilitators and asking each other questions. So this allowed us to get to know the method, figure out, what works, what doesn't work in their context, but it also strengthened our relationship as well and was a way to get to know one another. And it also allowed, like I mentioned, to discuss some of the key concepts. So we could talk about, what does mental health mean, or what does the concept of identity mean, and elicit this back and forth discussion about the questions that we had initially brought forward, the Canada-based team had initially brought forward, and figure out, is this a useful question? Does this fit your context or not? How would you change this? So just as some examples of that, something that we talked about was this concept of being more strength-based was unfamiliar to our Thailand-based team, that the Burmese culture was very humble and it was hard for you to think about what their strengths were. So, how do we ask these questions in more creative ways? Like, how did you overcome those difficulties in your journey? Or what would your family or friends say about you? And that could stimulate focusing more on strengths or on the concept of identity, which our partners said. They laughed when we brought up identity. They're like, an ID card, like documentation? We don't know what that means here. So that was really kind of enriched our learning experience. And I think here's where the research focus expands to encompass this process of exchanging knowledge, where the researcher and research roles become blended in these porous categories where we're all kind of learning from one another. And one of our partners said that even though these concepts of identity or strengths were less familiar, that they haven't had a chance to do this elsewhere, and that this was actually really useful to be able to provide this space. And I think for myself, it helped me better understand. I think really for me, a lot of this understanding was how important process is to research and not just outcome. And also that, usually in a project prior, I would have all the questions that I wanted to ask and a clear way of going about the research process. And it was really just this exercise in kind of letting go of control and really learning about their context and their world. We did have some limitations to our co-production. One of the biggest ones is that we couldn't speak any of the local languages. They speak so many languages, Burmese or Thai, Karen, and we couldn't speak any of them. And so, I wonder about what else could have, if they had been doing this in their local language, what concepts they may have generated that we couldn't engage in a dialogue about as freely. And similarly, there are translation inequivalencies. So I think it was like D'Souza Santos who talked about, who's a scholar in this field, who talks about, you know, how do we make sure that intercultural translation doesn't become the newest version of like a soft form of imperialism and colonialism. So even if like they can directly translate a word, it might not mean the same thing. An example of this is, you know, one of the ways we wanted to ask about identity was through asking about what are your values. And I think one of them said that, well, values is a numerical word, like what is the cost of something? So this is where like that kind of rich dialogue forms of what concepts fit, what doesn't. And this helps create some checks and balances on and so that we mitigate the risk of reinforcing kind of the superiority or the presumed desirability of global North knowledges. So I'm just going to put in some quotes. We asked our partners about prior experiences in research because we weren't sure whether they also found this to be kind of a reciprocal exchange. And one of our partners said that, you know, mostly the researchers come to ask us questions in an interview and only one time. They come, but they do not work with me. And the second one kind of exchanged. The researchers come and collect the data and go back home and they work with others. And then when we kind of asked them about their experience in our project, one of our partners had said, you know, we talk very detailed and deeply about the questions and then revise the questions that is relevant to our migrants. It's also different from the training that foreigners lead and that local people lead. So as a team, we learn a lot as well. You also learn from us. We also learn from you, right? It's not only us learning from you. We get more time doing this online, and then we have a chance to plan online training together. So we are continuing to learn and grow. And so I just kind of, you know, highlighted some of this process of exchange. And it was just, yeah, really, of course, meaningful to hear that from our partners too. And so the last tenet that I'll talk about is this idea of community ownership and transformation. And this idea of community ownership for me is really tied to power. And so I often reflect back on, you know, how did our research process confront, challenge, and potentially uphold power asymmetries? And I'll highlight our approach to lowering barriers to genuine participation and to promoting community ownership, as well as some of the tensions in doing so. So one of the like first and foremost kind of tensions is that if we had kind of followed our prescribed or presupposed rules, we might have kind of we easily could have reinscribed the status quo. I mean, even in the way that we approach this research, like the academic partners here, we set all the meetings, we provided the method and the initial terminology and questions. And when we initially started working together, our community partners said that, you know, they wanted recipe book instructions. They wanted to know what we wanted. Like they wanted us to provide, here's step A, then step B, then step C, and then they would come back and they would ask us, you know, did we get it right? And so I remember feeling challenged by that. Of like, well, it's not exactly how I want to conduct this, but if this is what they're asking for, how should I respond? So I think because we were able to meet over time, we were able to create this more back and forth. But I did not feel that tension at first of like, well, I guess we could provide them with the recipe book if that's what they're looking for. And you know, ultimately we didn't do that, and I think it was for the better for our partnership. The other piece is encouraging decision-making autonomy. So decision-making as a way to kind of transfer ownership to partners, like this is where we asked, you know, our partners to decide how they wanted to apply the method, who they wanted to do this with, which questions they wanted to ask. And because, again, we were virtual, we were also dependent on them for this. Like this wasn't something that Jessica or I could direct. And even in doing this, I still had questions for myself of like, you know, if we hand over all decision-making autonomy, do we risk burdening our partners? You know, how much control do they want to have? And we did ask them this question at one point, and they said that they want control over the research process in terms of like data collection and choosing what questions to pose to the youth, especially because of the language and cultural differences, and where they faced more barriers where were contributing to writing. And so they talked about like our teamwork is collaborating, and that you know, that academic partners can do the writing portions and share it with them, and they can provide feedback on the writing, but then they can make decisions about how, you know, how, where, when, who to use this method with. Some other tensions, I think I've kind of noted this a little bit already, but you know, we really wanted to avoid imposing unfamiliar concepts and really encourage the inclusion of local knowledges. You know, how can we make this better fit for your context? And yet sometimes the community partners, they were like, well, we actually do want to learn about identity or strength-based approaches. And so there was this preference or interest in Western perspectives. And again, for me here, I was like, okay, how do I navigate this? And I think this is a piece for me around, well, there's a difference between imposing knowledge and then someone choosing to integrate what fits for them and what doesn't, and how that is kind of a form of agency as well. And then other structural challenges to upending some of these power asymmetries are that, you know, I'm still embedded within an institution. I have to write my PhD at some point, and you know, thinking about what forms of writing are actually going to be useful to our partners. And, you know, can we be writing reports or other things that maybe are going to be more useful to them, but I still do have to write my dissertation, and we have kind of funding timelines that constrain how long the project can go on for as well. And I'm not, you know, the crisis context, I say that might be a barrier to taking full control and ownership, because they've had multiple times where they've had to kind of put pause, or like the peer mediated storyboard method isn't their primary focus, and it can't be, because they've been delivering urgent humanitarian aid. And so they still have talked about, you know, maintaining kind of contact around this and continuing to be able to ask us questions and debrief after sessions, you know, as they're learning, and that learning might be a slower process. I think like taking ownership of the method is a transformative process. It's also a slow one, like in the sense that, you know, through our repeated meetings, we've all been able to reflect a lot on ourselves. And for our partners, this has looked like reflection on how to use the peer mediated storyboard method given their particular skill set and context. And then becoming comfortable with taking the initial ideas and then changing them. And some examples for this are, you know, with our Suwannimit partners, for them, they have talked about how it can be easier to do things in a single session rather than meeting over 4 or 5 times because of limited youth availability. Many youth are in workshops and different trainings, and so our partners are as well. So repeated meetings is not always feasible. So this meant adjusting the method to maybe focus more on, you know, overcoming difficulties and goals for the future. Whereas our partner Angela, who's located in Chiang Mai, she has been able to work with forced migrant youth who are living in kind of prolonged displacement outside of the Mae Sot area, or some of them are outside the Mae Sot area, and meeting repeatedly. And in so doing, she also has a counseling background. So she's been able to kind of facilitate a really deep exploration of kind of hardship and trauma and identity. And so the method's kind of being used in different ways depending on who's using it. The questions that are asked are differs depending on who's using it. And then on my end, it really involves letting go of that original project intent. Because, you know, by really attuning to what our partners' needs are, what their capacities are, that transforms the purpose of the method and how it's delivered. And I think the other really important kind of transformational piece is the creation of relationships itself, because that, you know, goes beyond the research project. And I liked this quote that I saw in an article that says, you know, at the end, what will remain from these collaborations in the long run are often the collaboration spirit itself, including collaborative practices and ways of working. And so I'll just kind of summarize here with the lessons that I learned from engaging in this project. So the first was that transitioning to virtual research made it actually, I think, easier to redress some of these power imbalances and create more ethical relationships. And that was really surprising to me at the start. I thought, you know, how am I going to write about a context that I've never actually visited and haven't entered? But I kind of learned that you don't need to be on the ground to do ethical research or to do research that's meaningful, and that there have been other scholars who are working in the kind of remote participatory landscape who've also talked about how this remote landscape can create more equity because researchers and participants, they don't need to be present in the same geographical space. And that reflexivity and flexibility are crucial to ethical research praxis. I think this is true like in general, and perhaps especially when working in kind of fluid contexts that are disproportionately impacted by crisis and violence. And this question of like coming back to this idea of, you know, who's benefiting from this research. And at the outset, I mentioned, you know, very much in the sense that I get to benefit for my PhD, but we've also heard from our partners how they are benefiting and learning as well. And so I think this experience kind of shows that when we do adhere to strong anti-oppressive research ethics, that there are benefits that can be gained from these global North and South partnerships when done in this way. And then kind of finally, at least in my view, we can't fully flatten power dynamics. Like they are present, and no amount of knowledge, I think, exchange and incorporation of their voices will eliminate that. But we can aim to foster a research space that promotes accountability on global North or institutional partners, that fosters this mutual learning and humility, and that centers on giving power back to community by giving them ownership over the method or whatever it is that fits for any particular research context. So I think that brings me to the end of my talk here. I want to thank, again, the CFGS, their community partners, Dr. Ball and Dr. Costigan, who I didn't mention at the beginning, but she is my supervisor in the clinical psych program. Yeah, so I'll turn it over to feedback and questions. And again, anything that you folks who have so much expertise in this area can bring would be so helpful.
Wow, Deborah, thank you, and thank the whole team in terms of the the co-production of all of this knowledge. There's a lot of thanks to be shared there too, isn't there? You've raised so many important issues. I mean, the case study itself is so important, but what a necessary opportunity is for all of us to reflect on our own research practices. You know, I've been taking a lot of notes. So thank you for this. And of course, personally, but also, of course, the Center for Global Studies has been closely connected to research practices and community-based participatory research. And so this is a huge asset for the center too. So thank you for being here all year, right? And although even in my introductory comments, right, I suggested that somehow we'll get back to some, pre-COVID normal. Of course, that's completely the wrong way to approach it, because there have been opportunities and learning that come with the transition to things that are virtual. And okay, I have other comments and questions, but let me open it up first to our audience, to our community. And please either put your hand up and I'll ask Kayla and Jody to help me note that, or you can type something into the chat box. But first, Happy New Year and welcome to Dagmar. Hi, Dagmar.
Good to see you. It's good to see you. Also, should I keep my slides up, by the way, or should I stop?
Actually, I was really interested in that slide at the beginning where you talked about, well, some researchers just leave, and then can you go back to that one? Because I wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
About that one, and Happy New Year to you too.
Yeah.
And I was actually there for the last talk. I just didn't have any questions because Katrina's work is just not in my area of expertise, Martin. So I was really quietly participating in that one. So for this one, Deborah, you've talked a lot about the partnerships and the ethics of that, but I wanted to ask about the migrants themselves and what the teams have learned just from working with them, because that's the other part in the triangle, I guess, for me, is the relationship with the partners, but then the migrants, and you've talked about some that are in camps and some other researcher, I think later on you mentioned, who's working with people who are not in camp situations. So how do you navigate the ethical part of the research with the migrants themselves? They obviously will know that they're part of a study and so on and so forth. But I guess I was just curious from the theoretical perspective, how you navigate that. And then from a practical perspective, if you can talk a little bit more about always having an interpreter, because you're actually doing counseling work, even though it involves creative methods and art. But I guess I just wondered about that other person's presence, because I know that interpreters are often a problem in the Canadian refugee hearings. So I guess it's a two-part thing. So tell us a little bit more about migrants and the ethics of that, and then also about the interpreters and how that works with just how they interfere or how they become part of that process. And thank you very much. And I, of course, loved hearing more about what you're working on.
Thank you for those questions. They're excellent questions. I just want to clarify at the outset. So I'm actually not working directly with the youth. So the people who are working directly with the youth are all forced migrants from Myanmar themselves. So they speak the local languages. So the translation and equivalencies, I think, come more from our discussions about the concepts and then how to translate appropriately, or if those concepts should even be used. So I'm not sure. I'll come back to that second question. You can let me know if there's if that kind of helps to address that or not. But with respect to the first question, so yeah, navigating the ethics with the migrants themselves, that has been, I think, at least a challenge for me. I'm trained in clinical psychology, which has a very strong ethical protocol for working with folks in any kind of psychosocial context, and as well, and of course, there's always research ethics. So we have talked to, I guess there's a couple, sorry, I'm organizing my thoughts here because I have a couple of different responses. So the first would be with respect to confidentiality and privacy, because these people are meeting in groups. And we have had discussions at length with our team about what that looks like. They were concerned because they tend to be a pretty private culture, where they don't share a lot with others. So questions around, will this create gossip? How will we know that, that youth are going to feel safe to share? And so we kind of came up with scripts for confidentiality and for trying to create group norms that help to reinforce the importance of it being a confidential space. And also youth are allowed to disclose as much or as little as they want in the process. We have heard from youth that we were able to meet with some youth about what their experience was like. This was one of Angela's group not working in MESOT. And they were saying that, that they felt very safe. Angela had created this very safe and comfortable environment, and it would have sometimes been nice to meet one-on-one with a facilitator, or to have that option occasionally to be able to disclose very personal things, but that the experience of meeting in a group actually helped to create these networks of peer support, and that they still stay in touch. So it's like this dance that we do of figuring out, what's how do we help to create this safer space, but also help to create these connections. And then the ethics in terms of, I'm not sure if this is specific to, if you were thinking along these lines, but what happens if you disclose really sensitive experiences, let's say suicidality or past, trauma history. Some of this, I feel like our partners have done themselves around, what do I feel comfortable as a facilitator? How deep do I feel comfortable going? So I think in Angela's case, as a counselor, she can hold space for that and navigate that fairly adeptly. And for our partners who maybe are not trained as counselors, they tend to focus more, on goals and difficult experiences. And then if anything were to happen that was, a red flag, they are networked within that MESOT area to go to a particular clinic or another agency that can provide support. But it is an area that I feel like we don't have as much control over because we're not there and we can't really see exactly how it goes down. So it is tricky. I'm not sure, did I answer the interpreter question at all, or do you need to speak more to that too?
I don't know, but you can talk, like maybe you can just, expand on the interpreter one.
Yeah, so I guess for clarification, did you mean interpreter with because with the youth themselves?
Yeah, that's what I meant. But yeah, you said you don't work directly with them, but I guess it's a general question about how the research is done. Yeah,
so what we do is so our partners would go and so let's say Spring and HL would go and find a group of people to work with, and they would bring the method to them. They would try it out, and then they would come back to us and say, like, this is the questions we were asked. We didn't really know how to explain this, or this took a lot of time to explain. And so then we would discuss in our team, like, what are some other ways of explaining that concept? Does that concept make sense if we change it to this? And to get really specific, I think the identity one is a good one, because that's the one that we had probably the most back and forth about, around identity being an ID card there. So could we ask the question of, what communities do you belong to? Or how would others describe you? And then we gave feedback forms to youth as well. So our partners would then go and they would, maybe ask them about their experience answering those questions. And they said that, once they got kind of the hang of these terms, they thought it was quite useful to reflect on their identity, but that it needed to be kind of explained in a different way. Otherwise, we would totally lose that cultural fit of the concept.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that then makes the entire team reflect on the concepts again, right? Because you have the translation issue in there as well, and there's the cultural part. So I guess I was thinking more of interpreters as a problem, because that's what they often are, because they're from, different ethnic communities, or they do speak a different dialect, and that's what's often more the problem in the Canadian context. But this sounds more positive in terms of having the interpreter to navigate some of these differences. So that's quite an interesting contrast from what I hear.
Yeah, and I think part of it might stem from the fact that they have shared backgrounds, right? Some of them, that they're sharing the same, they're working with youth, if they speak Karen and the youth speak Karen, or they're, yeah.
Thank you, Dagmar. Natalie, did you want to turn your microphone on? Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Debra. It was really quite a revelatory talk for me, and really inspired a lot of reflection on my own experiences. So I'd like to, particularly at the end when you were reflecting on lessons learned and thinking about what was the impact of the fact that you did the work virtually. You reached a conclusion, one of your conclusions was that it's actually easier to redress power imbalances doing virtual work, which really tested some of my more deeply held prejudices. and I'm still absorbing what you had to say, but I'd like to ask you to expand upon that a little bit. And I'm going to sort of start you off with what I understood. It seemed to me that you particularly felt that the flexibility that you were able to offer and the extended timeline allowed you to build relationships in a way that was often atypical of this kind of research. And the thing that I am still troubled by is really, it goes back to the Boaventura de Sousa Santos quote that you gave us, where I wonder about if translation is just on the spot translation with no context, with no lived context. I think it does lend itself to soft imperialism, as I'm sure you do. And I think you were obviously haunted by the concern that that was something that might happen. But one of the arguments that, kind of classic cultural anthropologists have made is that being in a context can do that kind of thing that, Hans-Georg Gadamer talks about, that fusion of horizons, because you begin to the culture that you're attending to starts to be something that has lived meaning for you. And so the chances of soft imperialism, maybe they don't lessen, but I mean, the chances of escaping from it maybe increase. So I'm really interested in this because of my own deep ambivalence about doing virtual research. So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit more. Thanks.
Oh, that's a great question. And I think I should start off by saying I probably shouldn't have made such a bold statement as to say that no research on the ground is ethical or that. So I would like to maybe soften that statement now, thinking about how it's written. I think, that, I have so many thoughts. I guess in terms of the way that some of these partnerships have unfolded tends to be on a very short, quick timeline, right? So again, as you mentioned, this is kind of repeating what you said, but that extended timeline and us not needing to, like, if they needed to cancel a meeting that day, no problem, we'll meet 3 weeks from now, right? So we often canceled meetings last minute. We went through the whole summer, I think maybe with meeting once, if that. And had we been on the ground there might have been more kind of pressures to meet for the time that we were there. And I know there are other projects sometimes that can last for a few years and maybe wouldn't create those similar pressures on the ground. I'm not as familiar in some of the with a lot of the international development work, but that it alleviates some of that pressure because we have a lot of flexibility to meet at a later date when they're available. And my supervisor, Jessica, and I were talking about this idea of like needing to be on the ground because of that. And I felt the exact same way as you described. I'm like, I can't write about a context well. I'm more at risk of potentially imposing if I haven't seen what their day-to-day realities are, how they engage, and I think there's a piece of that I'm still missing. And at the same time, I think something that she and I have talked about or kind of exploring is this idea that even if we were there, we could never fully enter their realities because, I sit with so much privilege and comfort here that the thought that I could ever really understand what they go through in that deeper way is, definitely maybe more than I could if I'm here, but that I am limited, right, by that, in that I'm really just kind of a visitor there on this short period of time, and then I get to come back home and be comfortable here. So I think the other piece to it is that because we were virtual, I really had to be, and I wanted to ground myself in this lens, I was really intentional about kind of fostering these relationships and were intentional about that. Like they knew when I was writing, and it went back and forth. So they knew when I was writing like my comprehensive exams and they asked about it and we paused for meetings, right? Where we have to be much more intentional about getting to know each other and asking about one another because we wouldn't otherwise know anything about the context. I'm not sure. I don't know if I have any clear answers to your questions, maybe just more questions to your questions and musings. So I think your question is an excellent one and can definitely challenge my statement there.
If I can just quickly follow up, Debra, it sounds as if what you're saying is definitely that there were real strengths to doing virtual research that lent it a texture and insights that you feel certain you would have lacked if you'd been there in person, but that there may have been things that you're aware of that you feel you couldn't explore because of the lack of physical presence. So it's interesting. It's a much more mixed bag than I would have guessed. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Debra, maybe while we wait for more contributions, yeah, I think I have a bit of a follow-up on that in terms of the mixed bag. On one point, you talked about given this constant need for self-location and reflexivity, but then interestingly enough, the challenges that are posed by the need to adhere to institutional requirements, right? Mm-hmm. And why are they in challenge is kind of the interesting question. But one that I've tried to sort of reflect on more as a historian of the modern Middle East is around emotion And you talked about the need not to hold your emotional experiences and thoughts in check, not to hold back on your emotional experiences. And I for me, where that challenge is, you know, as we're often trained to do that, to hold your emotional experiences and thoughts in check, right? Whether that be anger or sadness or however one confronts these trouble. Is there more to say on that in terms of your own personal reflection? So you built on that, if I recall correctly, in terms of listening deeply, right? More deeply to people. Okay. But what about yourself? Like, what happens when you do open yourself to feeling the sadness or the anger or of those things at the same time as being a doctoral student at a university that's meant, well, in certain faculties, still naively, to be impartial and detached and et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, this is something, I think this was like a big part of my journey, right, through this process. I had a similar background in a more, you know, hold back emotion camp, especially early on in my training. And I had no, and I, at the start of my training too, like master's, you know, I had no qualitative background. So like, I didn't even know what I wasn't as familiar with terms like epistemology. And so I think this, sorry, and I'm not sure if I'll answer your question, so I'll start talking, but then pause me if I'm not really getting to a point, please. So,
I'm not sure if I had a question there, so thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Like, but the anti-oppressive research lens, it literally is about, for those who do have positions of power, it is about who you, like it, one of the purposes of it is to kind of situate yourself in the research, figure out your lens, what biases you hold, and to be anti-oppressive means to be less like traditionally professional in a sense, right? If we want to create genuine relationships and we hang on to this kind of traditional definition of professionalism, it can be an inhibitor. Especially, I think here, this being human was like being just myself, and you know, if they said something that was really impactful, allowing myself to show that emotion and to work through it, I think actually enhanced our ability to relate to one another. And that kind of human connection is also what drives the passion for the work together and for continuing to work together. And so for me, it meant that I had to like confront sometimes my own feelings on my own, like those feelings of guilt that I mentioned earlier, because that's what brings in some of the humility and some of the remembering that I'm not in control of this process, and that so much of this is, again, research's process rather than about what the outcome is at the end. Although the outcome is important too, but also focusing on process. I don't know if that answers it.
No, that's helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah. I note in the chat that Emmanuel, who had to leave early, unfortunately, just is also so very grateful for this. I think we all are. Well, of course we all are. And notes that the eagerness to share this with one's own with one's own students on so many levels.
Thank you, Emmanuel. That's very kind.
Natalie, did you have some follow-up?
Yeah, if there's the time, I do have a follow-up. I wondered if you were acquainted with the work that Hadley Friedland and Val Napoleon have been doing on, I think it's I think they just call it Indigenous Legal Research Methodology.
I'm not familiar with it, so I'll write it down.
Yeah, so they've been doing work on this, you know, so have lots of people, but they've been doing really interesting work on this that's just based over at the law school. And I think that it might be really interesting to compare the anti-oppressive techniques and tactics that your team has been employing with the work that they've been pioneering. And because they're actually, I don't know which, they're on maybe like the second or third generation of that working on that methodology and trying to, you know, come up with iterations that incorporate what they've learned from each couple of years worth of the research. So it might be really interesting for you to look at that and see. Of course, they're not typically doing it virtually, but I think they have been doing it virtually, of course, during the pandemic. And I don't know whether there's anything out that incorporates their insights based on virtual, but you know, just a thought, that something that might be kind of complementary to your own work.
Sure, I'll send you maybe an email to make sure or I'll look it up if I can't find it. I'll send you
No,
an email.
I can send it to you. Yeah, I mean, I can send you 2 articles actually that you might find useful. Yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, like we struggled actually to figure out, like, this is a bit of a side tangent, what epistemology to call, what to refer to our epistemology. Like, we were kind of situating it within these tenets, but being like, is this anti-colonial? And we actually brought it to our partners. We're like, how would you? They were like, well, we can't use the word, they talked about that this anti-colonial or decolonial approach didn't fit for them because of their history in Thailand and the way they viewed colonization in Thailand. And that's how we kind of landed in this like anti-oppressive research camp. So it'll be interesting to see other perspectives and other writings on it for sure.
Yeah.
And Dagmar.
I guess I'm just thinking about the crises on top of a crises, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on just the compounding effects, and because it affects the researchers to a lesser extent as the youth that you're working with. And I guess I just wondered how or if that features into your reflections, but also I guess in the practice, because of course the virtual aspect is part of that, but yeah, I guess that's just what I was thinking of as I was listening stuff about epistemologies and emotions, and because it contains like both of these things, you need to contain emotions, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, but at the same time we need to process it, and COVID makes that harder in some way, but then already being in a displacement position, it's already, a bad situation. So I guess I just wondered whether that's just, it doesn't matter that there's another crisis, or how you deal with that.
Yeah, it's something that we also wondered about, because at first COVID wasn't really brought up by the youth that were, so I guess in terms of the delivery of it, it wasn't brought up, but at some point they shifted to doing some of the work with youth online, and the youth, like, who could access it, right? So like this technology is a barrier for some people, that it's glitchy and doesn't always work super well, and at the same time those who have used it felt like it would have been better to be in person, but that online worked in the absence of that, and that there was this sense of feeling alone in COVID. And one of, I think, the girls who was in Angela's group had recently gone to Thailand, had recently migrated, and so for her to even be connected virtually to other people right away, because otherwise, she may not have met people for a while, was pretty huge, I think, for her. And I think there's a lot of right now, like there's a lot of migrants who are fleeing Kaya State in eastern Myanmar. And so there are many people who are kind of feeling the effects of the ongoing kind of military violence, compounded with COVID, making it really challenging. And I think our partners are as well. We haven't met with them for a few weeks because of that. I feel like I answered that, but
no, it's okay. It's just more just food for thought.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. I mean, we do talk a lot here about COVID learnings, right? That as we want to capture and hang on to all that we have learned and the various opportunities that have come with Zoom webinars, and certainly having Dagmar with us continue to join us on our Wednesdays is a phenomenal opportunity. While at the same time, there is much to be lost by not meeting in person in our seminar room. And if you'll allow me, just Jessica, if we were to have met here in our seminar room, it would have been a wonderful opportunity to have connected with you and brought you into the center community too. So I'm hoping maybe in the weeks or months to come that we can organize a lunch or something and connect more closely. So thanks to Jessica too for all of this. If there aren't any more kind of comments or questions, I think we can wrap this up. Let me just note, if I could, a couple of events just to keep an eye on future events that are coming up. One is with the Property and Society discussion group on Friday. We have Peter Cook and Neil Valance. And then the following week, we have webinar organized by the Canada-Chinese Focus project housed here at the center with Noam Chomsky, talking about the perils of policy, the dangers of certain policy approaches towards China at this moment. And details can be found either coming up on tap on Friday or on our website. So thank you to all. Thank you especially to Kayla and Jody and for their help, and to Debra for this fascinating and very, very rich and helpful talk.
Thank you all so much, and thanks for your good questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Debra.